we should all be out getting some sun instead of listening to Stuart this morning. As I was preparing, going over my notes for this morning, I was reminded, because this is very much a legal presentation, I'm reminded of the time when I was doing my first criminal jury trial. And I had been out of what I affectionately refer to as the idiot factory for perhaps a year or so, and been in my own practice for about the same amount of time. And I was doing a robbery case. It was on legal aid. Again, those of us who were just starting it, we took a lot of legal aid cases in those days. And it was a chap who'd robbed a jewelry store, and I'd elected, in fact, instructions from the client. He wanted a jury. So I had gone through the thing, the trial itself, and then we came actually to the summation, the quote pitch to the jury. And I had practiced, and I'd rehearsed in front of the mirror at home and in my office, and I'd rehearsed in front of my secretary, my receptionist. I finally then came actually to the actual trial, and I did my jury address. And while we're waiting for the judge charged the jury after the Crown Attorney, the prosecutor did his presentation, and I went outside, and the accused, my client's sister, was out there crying, and she said, "That was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. It almost reminded me or made me forget that he robbed the store." We're going to talk this morning about the International Criminal Court, and this is a fairly new iteration. It really is less than, in actual function, less than 25 years old, but it's the culmination of history. And in my view, it's particularly important. It's particularly important to where we are in the world now. We're, I suppose, stuck with the curse of Confucius when he says, may you live in the most interesting of times. And we certainly are living in the most interesting of times, and we're seeing history really unfold before our eyes, and very much in real time. And I'll use the acronym, the ICC. It's the International Criminal Court, and it actually was created by the United Nations, and it came to be as a result of what's called the Rome Statute. And the statute itself was developed in 1998, but the court itself couldn't come into actual operation until a certain number of states or countries had actually signed and agreed to the Statute of Rome, and had both signed as well as ratified. And there's a difference between signing the Statute of Rome and then taking it back to their home country and actually having their home country legislature or parliament ratify, saying yes, they are going to be bound by it. So it really was in 2002 that the court actually came into functioning. And I use the term to create a new world order, and not to create a new world order as such, but rather to provide some degree of predictability for those individuals who create an environment where the worst crimes to humanity are perpetrated. This is the headquarters of the ICC is in The Hague, and huge, grandiose building. The number of cases that it has done are actually minuscule compared to the size of the building itself. There have now three prosecutors whose offices are functioning. The current chief prosecutor of the court is a renowned jurist from the UK, and he's now leading the court, the prosecution side of the court. And in fact, he's the one who is now made the first announcements that the ICC itself is now looking into potential war crimes that are taking place in the conflict in Ukraine. And we'll talk about this a little bit more. There were originally 139 states. When I use the word states, remember countries that signed the Statute of Rome. But when we then go back, only 118 have agreed to be bound by it. And not so much the countries that have agreed to be bound by it, but rather those countries that haven't agreed to be bound by it. So who are, and we take a look at the countries who aren't India, China, Iran would come as no surprise. Japan is a bit of a surprise. The one that always gets me is Israel. Here is a country that was formed out of the ashes of the Second World War, and we look at, for example, the trials of ENRICHMENT and others, and yet Israel refused to be bound by the statute. And interesting, if we go back again to 2000, that time frame, I think when we peel back, there was a reason, and that is that Israel was concerned if they had acceded to the jurisdiction of the ICC, would they be then vulnerable for things that had taken place either in Gaza or in the West Bank. The United States and Russia. Russia, of course, is no surprise. The United States was a surprise, but the argument for those of us, for those that are American, remember we go back to that sort of time around 2000 when there was an argument raised, argument raised in Congress that to accede or to be part of the ICC would be to limit the scope or allow international intervention in domestic American law. Well, in fact, when you sort of look at what the ICC does, and we'll talk about that shortly, there is no intervention. We'll see that the ICC is complementary. That is, it will act when a country doesn't act in a legal fashion. So, what predated the ICC? Well, the first one I put up, of course, are the trials that took place after the First World War. And when we look at the trials that took place both after the First War and the Second War, they reflected what those of us who work in the area call victor's justice, that there were very few of the successful or victorious parties tried any of their own. Rather, it was always the vanquished that were put on trial. And there are two or three that are very interesting. I put the Dover Castle. In fact, Dover Castle was a hospital ship. There were, in fact, two hospital ships sunk by German submarines in the First World War. The first was the Dover Castle. The second was a similar name, the Landovery Castle. In one instance, the commander of the submarine had been told that hospital ships were actually being disguised to carry munitions and weapons. He sunk the ship, and his defense was that he had an honest belief that it wasn't a hospital ship, but it was carrying munitions, and he was acquitted. But in the second case, the hospital ship was sunk, and as it was going down, a number of the crew and others took to lifeboats, and the captain of the submarine ordered that the lifeboats be machine gunned. The officer of the deck followed that order through, and two of his subordinates were operating the machine guns, and actually a number of the survivors in lifeboats were killed. The captain of the submarine was charged. He fled to avoid prosecution. The officer of the deck was convicted, and the two sailors who were actually discharging the weapons were never really prosecuted, were never really tried, because the concept then was they were following superior orders. And when we go back to how the German Navy conducted itself then, much surprisingly enough, much the way the Russians are conducting themselves now, you give an order and you follow it, and sort of be damned the morality or ethics of what you're doing. And now morality and ethics blend over into legal theory, so that there's an obligation that if something is morally wrong, then you don't follow that order. There was another one that was very interesting. A French officer was convicted, and one of the few allies. He was, it was a German officer who was convicted. He had French prisoners, some of whom were wounded, and he gave orders to shoot them. Those orders were followed as he was advancing. And his defense was that, well, if he left them wounded, they might take arms and attack his people from the rear. That defense didn't go very far. We then go to the trials from the Second World War, and we all think of the Second World War trials as primarily from Nuremberg. Well, the Nuremberg trials themselves only dealt with a very narrow area and only sort of a certain number of charges. The main one, obviously, was sort of the charge of aggression against peace. And, of course, we see on the right-hand side, we see Fat Herman, and then next to him, the poor unfortunate Rudolf Hess. And remember that Hess was the last surviving prisoner in Spandau prison. But one of the things that comes out of the sort of sequence to the Nuremberg trials, where the bulk of the law that would developed after the Second World War did not come out of Nuremberg, but rather came out of a series of trials that took place in the various successful parties. So that the French had a series of war trials, the Americans had a series of war trials, as did the British, as amongst others did the Canadians. And this is where really the development of the modern law of armed conflict took place. And one of the things that really came out loud and clear from the cases out of the Second World War were the concept of command responsibility. And we'll talk a little bit later about command responsibility, but really what the short is that it provides an obligation on any level of superior command to know when a potential war crime is going to take place, and then to take measures to stop it, to halt it, or to punish those or report those who've been involved in it. When I use that, those are your own people, not the enemy. Very little attention is given to the Tokyo trials that took place after from the Far East, again after the Second World War, and there are any number of them. There are two that are very interesting. The first was the case as against the Japanese foreign minister, and he was charged against war crimes and was subsequently executed. But his defense was that he didn't know any of the war crimes were taking place. And one of the things that he was charged with were the terrible abuses that took place much earlier in the war, what we what we refer to as the rape of Nanking. And his defense was that he didn't know anything about it. And the prosecution at that trial simply laid out a series of newspapers that had been delivered to his office that showed photographs of what had happened in Nanking. The second one, and this is an interesting one, it's a case involving a Japanese general called Yamashita. And Yamashita, as the Americans were taking over in the Philippines, he had been separated from his troops. And he'd given an order to his subordinates that civilians were not to be harmed. His subordinates went on a rampage and killed men, women, and children engaged in rape, and any number of horrendous actions. He was tried, and his defense was he had no control over his troops. He'd given an order, they didn't follow it. He was convicted. General MacArthur supported that conviction. The case eventually went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the conviction was upheld. And that was sort of one of the real anomalies that came out of the Second World War, particularly the cases in the Far East, because really what it said was that notwithstanding the fact you'd given an order that something not be done, you were still held responsible. And for those of us again who sort of work in this area, this is a case that has never really made any sense. General Yamashita was subsequently executed. So now we move forward, and who can forget these two characters, Karadzic and Mladic. There are a number of cases that came out of the Yugoslav Tribunal. The Yugoslav Tribunal, remember, predated the International Criminal Court. And perhaps it was because of both the Yugoslav Tribunal as well as the Rwanda Tribunal that sort of were the precursors to the development of the ICC. Now, what's interesting is that if you look at sort of the upper corner, you'll see the logo of the International Criminal Court, former Yugoslavia. The acronym for that is the ICTY. The ICTY only used the two official languages, English and French. It didn't use, as part of its official programming, any of the various languages from the former Yugoslavia. Some of the worst crimes that really we've seen since obviously since now what's happening in Ukraine took place in the former Yugoslavia. And it was brutal because really what we saw were the Serbs versus the amongst others, the Croats, and the Bosniaks were sort of caught in between. And if you've ever been to Yugoslavia, the animosity between Serbs and Croats is palpable. It goes back not just to the time of the Second World War. Remember that the Serbs were allied with the Russians, the Croats were allied with the Germans, but the hatred between the two, the Croats and Serbs, goes back actually to the 13th century. I was part of a unit that had gone into former Yugoslavia in 2001. And we would meet a certain number of people, and the first thing they would say when I give you a name, their name was, I'm Stanislav. And they would immediately say, I'm either a Croat or a Serb. Well, what did that have to do when the conflict had ended? But some of and what we also saw out of the Yugoslav tribunal was an expansion of the culpability of civilian superiors for the actions of their subordinate troops. Now this is interesting. Remember, after the conflict ended, Karadzic kind of disappeared, but for a number of years he was hiding in plain sight, and that's what the center picture is. And there he is, the third picture. This is what he looked like at the trial of the ICTY. Then there was Mladic, and it would be complimentary to refer to him as the butcher. He's now doing life, and up until the final days of the trial, he was totally unrepentant for any of the crimes that or actions that took place from troops under his command, and to say that there was arbitrary murder, trafficking in human beings, sexual assault, rape, all these things were very common, and single-handedly, one of the worst offenses the crimes that took place during the Yugoslav, and there were any number of them during the Yugoslav conflict, was the mass killings in Srebrenica. And then there was Milosevic, and he was the sort of the titular head of Serbia, and he would have as well received a life sentence, as did the first two. But if we remember, he died. He had a heart attack and died before the trial was concluded. But he died in prison. The other, I think, most serious tribunal, series of problems that occurred again in that same time as the Yugoslav tribunal was the genocide in Rwanda. And I put these two pictures up. It's not pleasant, but let me tell you, that is what it was like in Rwanda. To the picture of the church, when I was in Rwanda a couple of years ago, I actually went to one of the genocide sites, into a church. And again, when you walk into a building like that, it was much like those of us who went into Vad Hashem in Jerusalem. When I left that building, I wasn't the same person that I went in. Had genocide taken place, and in Rwanda it was an absolute genocide. It was the Hutu majority dealing with the Tutsi minority, and it didn't matter whether women or children. They were simply, and I use the word slaughtered, and that's really what took place. A number of them were put on trial and convicted. No one was put to death by way of execution. But there have been since, again, as a result of the United Nations authorizing special tribunals, and remember the special tribunal can only be authorized under Chapter 7 of under the Charter, and more particularly, a tribunal can only be authorized as a result of a Security Council resolution. And we'll come to this in a moment, but there are a number of them. We should not only briefly refer to them. There was the Special Court for Sierra Leone. There was one for Lebanon that, in fact, is still operating now. There was, recall, the tribunal for Cambodia, and an ad hoc, but in fact it was a tribunal for the conflict that took place in East Timor in sort of the late 90s, early 2000. So the ICC, what is its jurisdiction? When I say what's its jurisdiction, What does it encompass? How is it formulated? And what does it do? Well, the first one that is by far the most serious crime is the crime of genocide. And the definition itself kind of speaks for itself. But what we have to remember is the term of genocide should not be tossed around or used without substance or thought. Remember that when we talk about what happened under al-Bashir in Sudan, how long it took for the actual term of genocide to be used, notwithstanding the fact that the Janjaweed were sort of a paramilitary a group operating under direction from al-Bashir, who were attacking civilians in the east part of Sudan. But what that group had particularly done was to target that particular group of civilians. So that would deal with perhaps a genocide. We've now seen in the last few days the description, particularly from President Biden, that what is taking place in Ukraine is genocide. But when we look at the actual definition, the question then is it? There is no question whatsoever that what's taking place as it pertains to civilians or those who are no longer involved or capable of being involved in the conflict itself deserve protection. But is there a deliberate attempt on behalf of the Russians to identify and therefore eliminate a particular portion of the Ukrainian population? And that's what genocide really implies. So, killing members of the group. Well, do we say that the Ukrainian civilian population is in fact the group, and the Russians intend to kill members of that group? If the answer to that is yes, perhaps it's genocide. Causing serious or body or mentally harm to members of that group. There is no question that serious bodily and mental harm has taken place. The pictures are vivid, but the question, I suppose, is, does it fall under the general umbrella of genocide? Deliberately inflicting conditions where virtually life is impossible and is calculated to bring on physical or related destruction of a group. You could sort of stretch it and say, yes, perhaps. Imposing measures intended to prevent births. This is, again, forced sterilization or otherwise, and if it's directed to a particular group, yes, that would qualify as genocide. And then forcibly transferring children. We in Canada are dealing particularly with this issue. When we go back to sort of the 1800s into really the 1950s and 60s, even a little while longer, we would take Indian children, Aboriginal children, from their families, from their reserves, wherever they were, and put them into residential schools. And most of the residential schools were operated by, quote, the church, either Protestant or Catholic or Anglican. And these children were really stripped of their identity. They were not allowed to use their own language. They only wore a sort of standard uniform dress. And when you deprive someone of their language, of their culture, is that a form of genocide? Well, certainly it's not physical genocide, but perhaps it's a form of mental genocide. And we in Canada are going through that very real angst right now of what had happened, 100 years ago. In fact, it's even sort of less than 100 years ago, because I remember when I was going to, when I was an undergraduate at the University of Ottawa, the Brothers of the Christian Schools were operating a residential school 50 miles from Ottawa, and sitting in the desk next to me, always well-dressed in dark suit, shirt, black tie, was one of the Brothers of the Christian Schools, and he was, what's the expression, hail fellow, well met, and we had no idea of what was actually transpiring in this school in the small French-Canadian town of Alfred, located about 60 miles east of Ottawa. Crimes against humanity. Now, this is one step lower than genocide, but in my view, what's taking place in Ukraine is a crime against humanity. Murder can take place directly, one person shooting another, but also engaging in such activity where you know or should know that deaths will take place. And if we look at what has taken place again in Ukraine, there should be no question whatsoever that that murder has taken place. And the follow-up is of any civilian population. Well, certainly, again, using current Ukraine as the model, there is no question that the civilian population has been attacked, and with knowledge of the attack. Now, here it's very interesting, because someone would say, well, on the Russian side, we didn't know what had happened. Well, we're now in the area of social media and instant communication, and it boggles the imagination that those in positions of command do not have access to Western media. You may disagree with it, but does that impose upon them knowledge of what's happening? In my view, it does, and therefore the potential defense of, oh, we didn't know what was happening, simply doesn't hold water. Crimes against humanity will include enslavement. Well, that may not be necessarily taking place now, but again, that's one of the categories of offenses that qualify as a crime against humanity. Deportation or forcible transfer. Interestingly enough, what's happened in Myanmar with the transfer of the Rohingya from Myanmar to Bangladesh. Is that forcible transfer? The answer to that, again, in my view, is yes. Imprisonment or other severe deprivation or deprivation of physical liberty, based on the foundations of international law. We use the term international law very loosely, but there are certain codes of conduct that are sort of implicit, and it's like the terrorism. There is no one specific definition of terrorism, but and I can't remember the name of the judge who said it, but he said, you know, what I'm looking at, I don't have a single hard definition of terrorism, but I know it when I see it. And this is the same thing with international law, except in a trial, there has to be sort of some foundation, and in fact, the foundations, when we come into a trial situation, are usually well laid out. Torture, that one's obvious. Sexual violence of any and all description. One of the things that has really happened, again, it comes out of the Second World War, but we've seen it particularly as well in the conflict of former Yugoslavia. Sexual abuse, primarily male against female and also against children, is very much, quote, a weapon of war. And I've seen particularly this when I'm working training UN peacekeepers in Africa. One of the things that the bad guys will use is when they'll come into a village, they will engage in rape and sexual abuse of women, also interestingly enough of men, but they'll engage in that because it's going to create fear. And when we're working in this area, what is the weapon? When we're working in a francophone environment, the troops are trained to understand that the rebels will use la peur, the fear. And fear is by far a greater weapon than the short-term physical use of weapons. Persecution against any identifiable group is permissible. Well, again, we look at in Myanmar, we look at the Uyghurs in China, but also to the persecution of a political group or any group. We take a look, for example, if you are a political opponent, are you subject to some form of persecution? The answer to that is when we look in sort of totalitarian states, the answer is yes. If someone who opposes the government, that may be an identifiable group. Enforced disappearance of individuals. This will happen more often than not, but interesting enough, we've seen it again in some of the South American jurisdictions, particularly, remember, in Brazil, and where there will be demonstrations of families with the pictures of individuals who have certainly disappeared. That again is one of the offenses the court will look at. The crime of apartheid. This came about really as a result of the pressure of the South African government during the negotiations to create the Statute of Rome. It has never been applied. The other one that's never been applied, it was a recent addition, is the crime of aggression. It was an add-on to the statute, but the question then, of course, is, again, and we look at the modern parlance, is an individual Russian, who obviously could appear at a person, for example, like President Putin, or perhaps his chief of military staff, and that select group, are they guilty of the crime of aggression? I think there's a very strong argument that they are, because when we go back again to what happened in the Nuremberg trials, one of the things that particularly von Ribbentrop was convicted of was the crime of aggression. Are the Russians, in the modern parlance, are the Russians guilty of the crime of aggression? In my opinion, yes. Now, the other thing to remember is that the ICC does not prosecute a state; it prosecutes individuals. When we go back in the first section, I think we were together, I talked about the International Court of Justice. That is one state against another state. And then there's the ICC. The International Court of Justice does not target individuals. It will use the actions of individuals to represent the actions of the state. The ICC, much like Nuremberg, prosecutes individuals. So then we have war crimes. And it talks about grave breaches, serious breaches of the Geneva Conventions. There are 4 Geneva Conventions, and the 2 that we really are concerned, I suppose the 3 that we are concerned about is, one, the treatment of wounded on the battlefield. The second then is treatment of prisoners of war, and the third is treatment of civilians. In any one of those, willful killing is a war crime. What is willful killing? That's killing someone who is either who is a civilian or who's no longer involved in the conflict. Again, when we look in today's modern sequences, we've seen the pictures of bodies lying on the street in Bucha. Was that willful killing? I have no hesitation in saying to me it passes the threshold. Torture or inhuman treatment, including biological experiments. This is a direct follow-through to what happened again in the Second World War. Remember that there were any number of biological experiments that took place, measuring of twins, how long would someone survive in freezing water, things of this nature. It really hasn't come to much fruition, but this again was one of the holdovers from the Second World War. Willful causing great suffering to body or health. This is a whole basket. But it doesn't take much to get past that threshold. So what is great suffering? What's suffering to one may be not suffering to another. The court in that case will use a subjective test, not an objective test. Did the individual himself or herself suffer at all? If the answer to that is yes, was it great suffering? That has yet to be determined. Of course, again, the lawyers, what's the difference between great and small? So again, it will be the impact that the impact that individual has felt as a result of what has happened. And when it says body or health, it's both physical as well as mental. So it may be a physical pain, but it also can be a mental problem. When I say mental problem, PTSD, waking up screaming at night, any number of these things. And we take a look at again, the photographs and the descriptions of what has happened in some of the civilian areas in Ukraine. Will some of these people carry the mental scars with them for years? The answer is yes. When we say, well, they should get over it, we look in our modern domestic environments, and we see how someone is a female who has been raped or abused, how that individual is going to carry the scars with her for the rest of her life. Well, this is no different. This is no different at all. Willful abuse of prisoners of war. This comes about as a result, again, of what happened during the Second World War, both in the European theater as well as in the Far Eastern theater. Unlawful confinement. This deals with primarily civilians rather than military, but confinement itself is you don't put, particularly in the military context, you don't put someone in a cage and say, you're staying in a cage and we're going to give you some some minimal sustenance, there are certain standards of care that have to be given to both military as well as civilian. The taking of hostages. This was particularly the de rigueur of the Germans during the Second World War, and the taking of hostages is, I think, probably exemplified. Do you remember the movie with Burt Lancaster called The Train? Remember it was the smuggling of stolen art from France back to Germany. And what the Germans had done is they had put civilians along the front of the locomotive to stop the partisans from attacking the train. Well, taking of hostages is to do the same thing. And taking of hostages is very close to the principle of human shields. And that's one of the things that is an absolute no-no. Military superiors. There's a principle of what we call command responsibility. And command responsibility means that it's incumbent upon a military commander or superior at any level to know that, when we say to know, prevent, halt, or punishment. So we say to know the environment where your forces are going to be working, but also to know your forces. You have to know, for example, what are their propensities, what are their strengths and weaknesses, and perhaps one of the glaring examples of failure to know is we look at William Kelly. They should have, his superiors, in this case Captain Medina, should have known that Kelly was not the sharpest pencil in the box, and would probably misinterpret the concept of, quote, cleaning out the village of My Lai. So that the military superior is responsible for knowing the environment where his or her troops will operate in, will know their capabilities, capacities, and then has a duty to stop it. And if he can't stop it, then to report the abuses that take place. Non-military superiors are different. A non-military superior, a politician, is only held culpable if he had information and the information was available to him or her, and he refused or she refused to take advantage of it, and therefore take the necessary stops. So on the military side, there's a positive duty to always be informed. On the civilian side, it's only if you knew something and or should have known. The ICC is not a court of first instance in any country. It is there if a particular country does not do something, then the ICC will come in, again, providing the certain ways that it will come into work, and there's certain procedures. So it's a court of last resort to bring to justice those who have committed these type of crimes and who are not being held to justice within their own jurisdiction. How does something get referred to the ICC? Well, any one of the signatory states, any one of the 119 parties that are members of the ICC can refer a case involving another state to the ICC. Ukraine, who is not a member of the ICC, has in fact opened the door to allow the prosecutor to come in. It originally started during the problems that started with the Crimea and Donbass area in 2014, but once the door was open, the prosecutor has been able to continue, in fact is doing work now. The Security Council can refer a matter under Chapter 7 to the ICC. Remember that there would be, I suggest, very little hesitation in referring a matter now from, again, what's happening in the former Ukraine to the ICC. There's only one problem, and that is that it would have to be a vote from the Security Council. Oh yes, and Russia has the power of veto. Can you picture Russia actually saying, yes, we're going to refer our actions to the International Criminal Court? The prosecutor himself can undertake an investigation, but the ICC has no jurisdiction when a case or matter is being investigated or prosecuted by a domestic court, by their own state. It will only come in where the the individual country is either unable or unwilling to conduct an investigation and prosecution. It doesn't deal with domestic offenses, robbery, drug trafficking, even terrorism. Terrorism is not within the jurisdiction should not be within the jurisdiction of the ICC. It's a domestic. When I say domestic, it's left to the individual courts of the country. So what happens is there will be a preliminary examination to see whether or not there's been a crime, and that preliminary investigation will then go to a judge, and the judge will say, yes, I think there is, carry on with your investigation. One of the things to look at, were there general proceedings in the home state, or were the proceedings of the home state simply a sham? And would the investigation, the opening of a file, serve the interests of justice? And this is always a nebulous one, but I think that it kind of speaks for itself. The initial appearance is a pretrial, and the court will then look to see, does the individual, firstly, is he or she above the age of majority? People under 18 cannot be brought before the court when the offense took place, when they were under the age of 18, and does the individual understand the significance of the charges against them? And that result, that will take somewhere between 45 to 2 months. But at that point, the charges are confirmed. So then a summons is issued, and very few people voluntarily come to the court. There's usually an extradition, a warrant issued, and they ask any number of signatory countries to extradite if they find the individual in question. And we'll talk about, when we get together this afternoon for a little bit, I'll give you an interesting anecdote there. An arrest warrant is issued. The trial itself takes place for 3 judges, and it's much like any trial. All the elements of the offense have to be proved beyond a reasonable doubt. So the judges consider all the evidence, both pro and con, and they'll issue a verdict. If there's a reasonable doubt, the individual is acquitted. If found guilty, the trial court can issue a sentence. The usual maximum is up to 30 years, but there is availability for a life sentence to be issued. The judges, too, there is a fund that, again, is separate within the ICC structure for reparation of victims. And this is very similar to what happens in the European Court of Human Rights. There's what's called the just satisfaction. But here there is a fund for reparation of victims. This is what the ICC actual courtroom looks like. So you see the 3 judges up on the top, and there's the gallery in the bottom, and on either side is the prosecution and defense side. Appeals. There are 5 judges of the court on the appeal bench, and they won't be the same judges that heard the case. And they will either then approve or confirm the first judgment, set aside parts of it, and send it back for retrial. They have the capacity to approve parts of it, to reject parts of it. They have the power themselves to amend it, or they can completely reverse the decision, much like our domestic courts. And this is usually the end of it. Unless part of the case is sent back down again, at which point it may work its way back up. There is one sort of anomaly, and that is if a case is closed but no verdict is actually issued, then the prosecution can bring the matter back on again. That has yet to happen. And sentences are served in countries that are signatories to the statute. I use the term "height for justice never ends." El-Bashir, remember, from Sudan, he did the Janjaweed. The ICC issued a warrant. He's still in Sudan, and he has his own domestic problems. Wafali, he comes out of, again, the former Libya. There's an ICC warrant out for him. Gaddafi's son, again, a real piece of work. Interestingly enough, Gaddafi's son was courted by, of all things, the Canadian firm SNC-Lavalin, who were prepared to offer more than $1 million, plus a yacht and a number of other things, for SNC-Lavalin to do a construction project in the former Libya, or at least in Libya. Kony, Joseph Kony. I'll refer to him as a real piece of business. He was the commander of the LRA, the Lord's Resistance Army, and he did any number of horrendous things. But the thing that always sticks in mind is the fact that he was responsible for the recruitment and use and abuse of child soldiers. And anyone who abuses a child is, in my view, one of the lowest forms of life there is. So, now in the space of 40 minutes or so, you now know everything that I know about the ICC. It's a living organism. It's a living organism. And it's going to be interesting to see how, for example, what's going to happen in Ukraine. One of the things to consider, we talked about before the complementary jurisdiction of the ICC. The Ukrainian Prosecutor General has she's opened a file on war crimes in Ukraine. Now the question then is, who will take precedence? Could the ICC say, you are not competent to undertake investigation and trial of war crimes, leave it to us? Or would there possibly be a defense saying, just a second, there is a domestic trial, investigation and trial that may take place under domestic auspices in Ukraine. The ICC should stay out of it. This will be an interesting thing to watch because, again, we're seeing these things in real time, which brings us back again to where we started with the curse of Confucian. Are we living in interesting times? This afternoon, when we get together, I'd like to talk about sort of how war crimes developed, because again, this is sort of very real time, and there's a difference between the Geneva Conventions and how they're applied or not applied, and what we call the law of war, the laws of armed conflict. And what I'd like to be able to do is sort of just to discuss this amongst ourselves, and there'll be questions back and forth of how the two came to be, and how sort of now we refer to the Geneva Conventions as the law of armed conflict. Well, but it's a process, and I think that if we have the understanding of, or at least a bit of an understanding of how this developed, it will make our day-to-day understanding of what we're seeing again in real time, it'll make it more relevant. So, thank you very much for joining me this morning. And I'll be sort of wandering around. I'll be outside for a few minutes. I would be delighted to stop and talk with you. But the only caveat that I have is that I love to answer questions, but please only ask me simple questions.